The horrendous 1986 meltdown at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine is still the worst nuclear accident in history. In fact, according to the June 17, 2019 issue of Business Insider magazine, Chernobyl is still considered to be the most severe nuclear disaster in the world, and was worse even than Fukushima in Japan in 2011 and the 1979 Three Mile Island accident in southeastern Pennsylvania in the United States. This article commemorates the 35th anniversary of this terrible catastrophe and is a tribute to the brave men and women, many who gave their lives, to help keep millions safe from its toxic horrors. A nuclear physicist from the University of Buffalo named Andrei Karsukov had a terrifying experience at the Chernobyl plant when he reported hearing someone screaming for help while he was there in 1997. Visiting the infamous Ground Zero of the Chernobyl disaster, he said he arrived there at around 7:30 a.m. and went straight to the sarcophagus of Reactor 4. While taking readings, he reported to officials that he could clearly hear someone weakly but desperately screaming for help to put out a fire. So he ran back upstairs and told those who let him in what he had seen. But they told him that he was the first person to enter the place in 3 years. And not only that, they reminded him that there was a password to get in, a handprint to get in, and that someone going in without their knowledge would have set off an alarm. As if that wasn't strange enough, before the disaster in early April 1986, people living in the area started experiencing really strange things. There were reports from plant workers of seeing a large, black, bird-like creature with a 20-foot wingspan and large, glowing red eyes, which would come to be known as the Black Bird of Chernobyl. Those who saw this apparition also reported suffering from such things as terrible nightmares and threatening phone calls, which worsened until the morning of the accident on the 26th of April, 1986. Many researchers attribute the things reported at Chernobyl to the Mothman, an eerily similar creature that is said to have plagued the town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, just before the failure of the Silver Bridge on 15th December 1967, killing 46 people. They also claim that historical evidence suggests that this entity appears to be a harbinger of death, as Mothman-type creatures have been reported elsewhere in the past, and, as in both cases, Chernobyl and the Silver Bridge, the phenomena hasn't been reported since. While conducting a paranormal investigation of Chernobyl, and specifically the remnants of Reactor 4, the Destination Truth team from the Sci-Fi Channel were stunned to witness what appeared to be a human figure on an infrared camera system running inside Reactor 4. Most of us go out of our way to avoid things like nuclear disaster sites. But some apparently think, hey, let's sneak in and paint the place up. Rumored to hail from places like Belarus and Germany, dark graffiti artists, ignoring reports of lethal radiation levels, have over time slowly stormed the exclusion zone with their arsenal of multicolored spray cans, leaving their works of art, some hauntingly beautiful, some equally disturbing, across Pripyat itself and the surrounding area. Much of the more dramatic graffiti is in the city of Pripyat, where artists have painted silhouettes of the missing inhabitants of the abandoned city, who were evacuated the day after the accident on 27th April 1986, never to return. In one building, for example, a little girl with little ribbons in her braids is shown reaching for a light switch, while outside, a little boy pulling his toy truck seems to be peeking around a corner as if to surprise someone. In other buildings, the walls are adorned with silhouettes of people who look as if they are dancing, while in another, 3 children are frozen in midair, as if they have just jumped off an unseen trampoline and are floating while holding each other. Perhaps in joy, perhaps in horror. It is up to the viewer to decide. Many feel it is no coincidence that many of these silhouettes resemble the disturbing nuclear shadows left by the victims of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the Second World War. Many may not be aware that on the 26th of April, 1986, the Pripyat amusement park was still under construction and had never been officially opened. Scheduled to open in just 5 days, on May Day, 1st May, the park stands as an impoverished and abandoned icon of the Chernobyl disaster and a stark reminder of all that might have been. The park featured all the usual carnival favorites, such as an 85-foot Ferris wheel, a parachute ride, bumper cars, boat swings, and a shooting gallery. Many Soviet cities had similar amusement parks called Parks of Culture and Rest, and some still operate today, but Pripyat Amusement Park never got its day in the sun, although it was briefly opened to the public on 27th April before evacuation orders were issued later that day. Although the park wasn't ready for visitors, local people were thrilled to get the chance to visit the fairground, even though most of the rides weren't working. Today, the park sits forlorn and lonely, a life never lived. The bumper cars sit where they were abruptly left, with leaves swirling around the ride. The Ferris wheel is frozen, the paint peeling and fading. The paint on the yellow canopies is still bright in places, but elsewhere, the orange color of rust and neglect prevails, silently moaning a lost history. It's been 35 years since the Chernobyl disaster, and although wildlife seems to be thriving, flora and fauna are showing some startling signs of radiation. According to a study begun in 1991, the organisms responsible for decomposing and returning organic matter to the ecosystem, such as insects, fungi, and microbes, are showing symptoms of radioactive contamination. One of the more pronounced phenomena has been dubbed the bloody red forest, a series of woods where all the pine trees turned a blood-red color immediately after the meltdown and died shortly afterwards. The most disturbing aspect of the bloody red forest is that even 15 to 20 years after the disaster, these trees had not decayed, whereas most trees turn to dust within a decade. With this in mind, the scientists decided to carry out some tests by filling specially prepared rubbish bags with leaf litter from uncontaminated areas, making sure there were no insects or decomposers present, and then leaving the bags in both contaminated and uncontaminated forest areas in the exclusion zone for almost a year to check the decomposition rates of the leaves. Bags left in uncontaminated areas performed as expected, with normal decomposition rates of between 70% and 90% of the leaves decomposing. However, leaves in contaminated areas retained 60% of their original weight, indicating much less activity by natural decomposers. This suggests that radiation exposure has had a detrimental effect on the ability of the Chernobyl ecosystem to replenish itself with nutrients, which could be the cause of the observed stunted tree growth. A more immediate concern, however, is that leaves in contaminated areas remain intact and dry after almost a year, and could pose a fire hazard, raising the risk of radioactive contamination being spread by forest fires outside the exclusion zone. Horror films about evil dolls that come to life, such as Child's Play, Dead Silence, and Poltergeist, to name but a few, have always done well at the box office. Perhaps it's their inherent creepiness, as dolls can appear dead even in daylight, with their board-like limbs, lifeless eyes, and thousand-yard stare. But when abandoned after a nuclear disaster, The effect is magnified and serves as a stark and truly sad reminder of the tragedy that took place there. The 49,000 people of Pripyat who were evacuated on 27th April were told it was only temporary, so most thought they'd be back soon and left everything they owned behind, including the children who abandoned their toys. Many left right where they were being played with because they weren't allowed to take them. So little girls left their precious dolls wherever they were when the evacuation order was given. At home, at school, in nurseries, and many of these dolls were left in the real-life poses that only children could imagine in their wonderful young imaginations. Many of those left in these sad play scenarios have suffered severe radiation damage, making their appearance all the more disturbing, while the position of some was most likely staged for the cameras of future dark tourists. Many of these tragic reminders have been captured on film with their radiated faces and blank stares in such postures as peering out of windows, wearing gas masks, holding on to each other in an apparent gesture of mutual comfort, resting in the ruins of the catastrophe, lying peacefully in a bed of roses, or sleeping with their eyes open in their cribs. One of the saddest is a tea party of 4, forever frozen in time. The Chernobyl stalkers are a truly bizarre subculture. They were born out of the repression and oppression of Soviet history, along with the influx of American-style commercialism that helped breed corruption and then economic crisis in Russia and Ukraine. Or so some experts believe. In short, stalkers are those who illegally enter the 621 square mile exclusion zone, apparently for their own morbid curiosity, much like the so-called rubberneckers who, when driving past the scene of an accident, can't help but crane their necks to gawp as they drive by. The phenomenon was legitimized in 2007 when Ukrainian computer programmers introduced STALKER, a post-apocalyptic first-person shooter video game set in a virtual exclusion zone around Pripyat and Chernobyl. The acronym stands for Scavengers, Trespassers, Adventurers, Loners, Killers, Explorers, and Robbers. The game's creators said they wanted to tell the world about Chernobyl and, of course, make a cool video game. STALKER has done well, selling over 5 million copies, including 5 sequels, mostly in Russia and Eastern Europe. High up on the roof of Pripyat City Hospital, number 126, a sign ironically reminds residents of the freshly minted Soviet model city, health of the nation, wealth of the country. Located in the micro-district of Pripyat on Druzhby Narodov Street, the hospital's main wing is part of a sprawling medical complex called MSCHU 126. Pripyat City Hospital had 410 beds, with clinics and outpatient facilities spread out and interconnected. With a dental clinic, a maternity ward, an infectious disease clinic, and a morgue, the city was prepared for any imaginable emergency. The operative word, of course, being imaginable, as no one could have foreseen the horrific events of 26th April 1986. Normally a busy hospital anyway, after Reactor 4 went into meltdown on that fateful night, 237 plant workers, firefighters, and soldiers ended up being treated for severe radiation poisoning, many of whom never left the hospital alive. According to a 2006 World Health Organization (WHO) report, 28 firefighters and rescue workers died within the first 3 months. The victims' clothes were so contaminated that they had to be taken to the basement of the hospital, where they remain to this day. Eventually, the victims were taken to Moscow, where the only facility capable of treating radiation victims was located. Hospital records and medical equipment were strewn about in a haphazard mess, and the basement is the most heavily radiated place in the city and had to be abandoned within days of the incident due to skyrocketing radiation levels. To this day, many believe the place is haunted, as during a paranormal investigation of Chernobyl, the Sci-Fi Channel's Destination Truth team discovered several human-like figures moving through the frame in the hospital's CCTV footage. The Earth has both a magnetic field and an atmosphere that protect us from dangerous radiation, neutrinos, and cosmic rays from the sun and space. NASA is well aware that astronauts on the International Space Station, ISS, are exposed to 20 times the amount of radiation we get on Earth, and that this poses a serious problem not only for the crew, but also for sensitive electronics. So after discovering that a fungus called Cladosporium sphaerospermum, which thrives around the heavily contaminated Chernobyl disaster site, consumes radiation through radiosynthesis, they decided to experiment with it in space, and over the course of a month found that the fungus actually blocks radiation by literally eating it. The experiments on the ISS revealed that Cladosporium uses melanin to convert radioactive gamma rays into chemical energy, and that this ability could prove useful in future space exploration. It is hoped that the fungus could be used both to protect equipment and crew from deadly radiation during long space flights, and more importantly, to help clean up radioactive waste. One of the most obvious questions that arose after the 1986 Chernobyl disaster was whether or not wildlife would suffer from mutations. Hundreds of people died soon after the accident, and in addition to birth defects, many more developed cancer. But scientists around the world have been surprised to find that wildlife in the exclusion zone has returned much sooner than predicted, and life seems to be thriving under the circumstances. Many researchers thought it would take decades, maybe centuries, for life to come back from the accident, but it hasn't, and the animals are doing quite well, for the most part. But they weren't surprised by the effects of radiation, and not all of them were spared. 10 years later, it seems that both the wild and domestic animals left behind were indeed affected, being born with major birth defects such as multiple heads, muzzles, and legs. They also found other defects such as a cat with 2 faces, a lamb with 8 legs, a 2-faced calf, and another calf with legs growing out of its back. Plants have also suffered, including the so-called red forest, a stand of dead, discolored pines killed by radiation. There is a new phenomenon called dark tourism, and the Chernobyl disaster site and the city of Pripyat are at the top of the list, literally the hottest tourist destination in Ukraine. No pun intended. In commemoration of the 35th anniversary of the historic tragedy, and made possible by the COVID-19 pandemic, Ukraine International Airline began offering air tours the day before the anniversary of the fateful day when Reactor number 4 melted down on 26 April 1986, giving passengers a unique view of the abandoned nuclear power plant and the city of Pripyat for around $106 US, 2,970 Ukrainian hryvnia. Their ticket buys them a seat on an Embraer 195 jetliner with a panoramic view of the city and the exclusion zone from just above the minimum permitted altitude of 3,000 feet above Chernobyl, and the chance to take a selfie with the pilot. Although ground-based tours of the Chernobyl control room and reactor number 4 are available, a protective suit is required, making the aerial tours an instant hit with tourists, with the premiere selling out in 2 days. Although the coronavirus has severely curtailed tourism to the disaster site, it hasn't stopped it. In 2019, 104,000 tourists visited Chernobyl, compared to 32,000 in 2020, with the hugely popular HBO series Chernobyl accounting for 80% of this figure. Chernobyl and Pripyat continue to be visited illegally, despite the dangers and the threat of very heavy fines for those caught indulging in their dark obsession.